So by now, I would hope you've all had the opportunity to watch my most recent Ruby Crest Trail trip video. What I'd like to talk about today are the choices I made that led to my knee injury and ultimately having to leave the trail a little bit early. So the rough plan for this trip was to drive down on a Thursday night and camp at the trailhead. I then wanted to walk the entirety of the Ruby Crest Trail twice, basically making it an end-to-end out and back hike. Normally this trail is done from the south end to the north end, and you shuttle cars to both ends. So you're walking, depending on who you ask, anywhere from 38 to 43 miles. I didn't have anybody else to go with, and I didn't have a way to really shuttle cars to both ends when I was alone. So I came up with this wild idea to just walk the entire trail twice. My very first mistake was when I got to the trailhead, instead of taking the time to set up my tent, or at the very least laying down a ground sheet and cowboy camping, outside of my car, I decided to sleep in my Subaru Crosstrek. I've done this before, and I know from experience that it does not facilitate a good night's sleep. I know that I can't get comfortable. I know that it's difficult for a guy my size to sleep in a car that size. But I was feeling kind of lazy. It was 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and the idea of setting up my tent in the dark didn't really sit well with me, and it was very windy, so the idea of just sleeping exposed on the ground didn't sit well with me either. So I made the unfortunate decision to go ahead and just sleep in my car. Friday morning, when I woke up, I felt decent. I ate breakfast, had my coffee, got my pack all put together, and started out on what was supposed to be a 17-mile day. For most of the morning, I felt pretty strong. And then somewhere around noon, just after my lunch break, things started to go south pretty fast. And I kept trying to convince myself that it was external elements. It was the air quality from all the smoke in the air. It was the heat, because it was a pretty warm day. But ultimately, it was because I didn't get enough sleep. I didn't get good quality sleep, and then I overexerted my already tired body. The second mistake that I made was pretty directly related to the first. I had multiple opportunities to stop and camp in places where I would have had water, I would have had adequate tent sites, I would have been comfortable, but I let my ego take control. And instead of using my common sense, and instead of just allowing myself to not finish this grand expedition that I had designed, I pushed on and pushed on and pushed on until I was just so physically exhausted that no amount of food was going to help, no amount of electrolytes or energy supplements were going to help. My body was just done. My quads were quite literally vibrating. What I should have done was taken the first opportunity to camp, even though I had only walked 6 miles instead of the 17 that I had planned. It would have been a much safer and much healthier decision if I had just recognized the exhaustion, called it early, and set up camp. The following morning, which would now be Saturday morning, I woke up at Overland Lake. I felt great. I had ended up sleeping almost 9 hours the night before, which is unusual for me, not just on the trail, but just in general. That is a lot of sleep in my world. And the second day of hiking was strenuous, but manageable. And so I went to bed that night feeling like everything was great, everything was wonderful, I had conquered the trail. Woke up the next morning with that attitude still in place. And as weird as this is to say, the Ruby Crest Trail is a very different trip going north to south than it was south to north. It's much more strenuous. The day itself was hotter, which adds to the difficulty. And it's just, there's no other way to look at it. It's a different trail going the other direction. And I approached it with the same attitude that I had approached day 2. You know, I felt great all day, day 2. Super strong, could conquer the world. Day 3, I went into with that same amount of gusto and essentially tried to just recreate that same hike backwards. Side note, before I even left Reno, I failed to properly inspect my equipment. I was carrying my Osprey Exos 58 backpack, and one of the small little brackets that holds the frame into place and keeps tension on the frame had snapped off. And so the frame was sitting kind of more in the center of the pack instead of to the far right edge, which shifted the weight of the pack so that my right hip and right leg were carrying the bulk of the weight for the entire trip. The first couple of days, that wasn't a huge deal. It was somewhat noticeable. I felt a little bit of discomfort in my lower back on that right-hand side, but it wasn't terrible. It was totally manageable. The third day was primarily side hilling, and 100% of the side hilling had my right leg as the uphill leg. So it was dealing with most of the stress and that shift in pack weight. The final nail in the coffin, and I would argue the biggest mistake that I made, and honestly, if you take nothing else away from this video, this is the point you should really focus on. I underestimated this trail and I overestimated my personal abilities. I know that I'm capable of walking 20 plus miles a day, back to back to back to back. I've done it on PCT section hikes. I did it on the Tahoe Rim Trail. This is something I know my body is capable of. But, as a very wise woman once told me, not all miles are created equal. The Ruby Crest Trail is a very strenuous and very difficult trail. It's fairly well maintained, it's overgrown in certain sections, but because it is an equestrian trail and a hiking trail, and I think the primary design had equestrian traffic in mind, it's just a difficult trail. And just because I could walk 20 miles a day back to back to back to back along a flatter section of the PCT or along the entirety of the Tahoe Rim Trail doesn't necessarily mean I can do that on every trail, and definitely doesn't mean I could do it on the Ruby Crest Trail. So the way my injury came about was 2 to 2.5 fold. One of the primary problems was that because I felt so good in the morning, I didn't do my normal stretching routine. And at my age, and the more I hike and the longer hikes I go on, that routine becomes more and more and more important, and I ignored it the morning of day 3. The second issue we touched on a little bit with the broken frame on my backpack, putting way too much weight on what was now going to be an uphill leg on a side hill for 4 to 5 hours. Just constant strain and constant stress. So the 0.5 in this, because I had walked this entire section of trail the day before, I felt very, very comfortable. And I wasn't paying as much attention to my foot placement as I should have been. What ultimately happened was I planted my foot on a solid piece of granite. The tread on my trail runner did exactly what it was designed to do, and it gripped that granite. My body turned, and my foot stayed in place. Immediately knew what happened. I felt it just right in the moment. I've just twisted my knee, and it hurt the second that it happened. The pain started. I was only about 3 miles away from where I planned on camping that night. And where I planned on camping that night was the only available water source, so I sort of had to make it there. And I did. About 2 hours earlier than I had planned, which also was probably an issue. I think I pushed myself harder on day 3 than I should have. You know, I had all day to walk this 11-mile stretch, 13-mile stretch, and I shaved off 2 full hours going in the more strenuous direction. When I got to camp, I tried to go through a little bit of my stretching routine, but honestly, the pain in my knee was so intense that I wasn't able to really do any of the stretching that I knew would help alleviate some of the pain. So I had a decision to make, and if you watched the other videos, you know kind of how this played out. But the thing to take away from this, and I think the thing that I personally need to take away from this, and I need to remember as I go out on these trails, and especially on these longer trips that I try to do, you don't have to finish. Just because you've planned a hike from A to B doesn't mean you have to get it all done. And especially if there's an opportunity to bail out if things go sideways, I chose not to listen to what my body was telling me, and I paid the price. I hope you got something useful out of this video. And again, if you only take away one bit of information, if you only hold on to one thing that I've said over the course of this video, just remember that all miles are not created equal. And just because you can do these extraordinary things on one trail, that doesn't necessarily translate to every trail.